Welcome back to the OSM channel. In today's video I'm going to teach you how to replace the head gasket on a Briggs and Stratton 19.5 horsepower OHV motor. In this case, this motor is on my Craftsman LT2000 lawnmower and I need this engine to run. Now when people think blown head gasket, they think, oh, it's the end of the world. Well, on this motor, it's not a big deal. As long as you haven't run a dry of oil and your rings aren't completely shot, then there's a good chance you can revive your motor with a head gasket, and those head gaskets are normally like $16, $17. So what happened with my mower and why do I suspect I have a blown head gasket? Well, the other morning I left the mower outside and I went to start it and it would not start. I opened up the engine hatch and I found that there was kind of a coating of oil all over the engine. Additionally, I checked what you normally check on an engine if it doesn't start. It had spark, it had fuel, it didn't have a restricted air filter. What else could it be? Well, a lack of compression. So what I suspect has happened, we have a blown head gasket and that is leading to excess crankcase pressure. And then that excess crankcase pressure has found a way to escape from the crankcase and it's just coating the entire engine. Now what's interesting, the engine will start right now, but it's just not running right. So we will take things apart here shortly, but I just want to go over some other signs and symptoms that you may have a bad or blown head gasket. Lack of compression, obviously. If you have to add oil to the mower frequently, that's a red flag. Like after every mow, you got to add oil. Good chance you have a blown head gasket. If your engine is blowing smoke, if it starts smoking all of a sudden, that's a red flag. If your engine is covered in oil, that is the case for my mower. If it's hard to start and has low compression, I also have that symptom. And additionally, if your spark plug is covered with oil, that's also a red flag. And when I did take the spark plug out the other day to check spark, it was covered in oil. You can see the oil all over the place, so we definitely have something going on here. Anyway, I'm going to start degreasing the motor now. This engine is covered in dirt, grease, grime, and oil. We need a super tough degreaser to get this engine nice and clean. A while back, Super Clean sent me out some products to try out. This is their Super Clean aerosol can. Works well for engines, so we're going to spray this all over the engine, let it sit for a few minutes, hose it off, and see how well it works without any scrubbing. You guys tell me what you think, but I think it did a phenomenal job. I mean, for a product that didn't require any scrubbing, got probably 90% of the grease and grime off this motor. There's a few spots I need to touch up, but I think I'm going to hit it again once I remove this engine cover. So let's pull it back in the garage and we'll pull this engine cover off now. To remove this engine cover, you're going to need to remove 4 7/16 inch bolts. One here, one here, one here, and one right here. Obviously there's still a good bit of grease and grime on this motor, so I'm going to cover up the intake on the carburetor with a glove, and then we will degrease this motor again. Get it nice and clean. So to remove this head, we're going to have to remove the valve cover, exhaust, and unbolt the intake assembly. So I'm going to start with the valve cover here. The bolts for the intake are 3/8. Definitely oil there. Now to remove the exhaust, there's going to be 2 1/4-inch Allen head bolts, one here and one on the other side of this exhaust pipe, and then you also have a 3/8 inch bolt right here. Next, I'm going to remove the spark plug and ensure that the engine is at top dead center. If you look at this spark plug, you can see that there's a lot of oil on there. That's a red flag. Now, to ensure that the engine's at top dead center, I'm going to use a screwdriver, insert it through the spark plug hole. I'm sure I'm going to get yelled at in the comments for this. But then I'm going to rotate the flywheel manually until that screwdriver is up all the way. And that is at top dead center. Next, I'm going to remove the rockers. In order to remove the rockers, you're going to need a T20. And if you look, there's a nut, but there's a T20 lock fastener inside the nut. So I'm going to hold the nut in position, back off that T20. I like to get it to where it's about flush with the end of that bolt. Should be able to spin this off by hand the rest of the way. Now be careful, on the top of the valve there is going to be a little metal cap, and make sure you do not lose that. There's our rocker, there's that cap that goes on top of the valve, and our push rod. I want to share with you a problem that I'm noticing, and we will have to address this. So if I push in on the lower valve, you can see that I can push this valve in all the way, and that's how it's supposed to be. Now if I do the same thing on the upper valve, notice that it goes in probably halfway and then it's like clicking on something. This one goes in all the way, top one stops before that spring is totally compressed. So I believe what has happened is there's actually a valve guide inside this head, and I believe it's moved forward slightly. Now we will confirm that once we remove this head, but with that, two options. We could either tap it back and hold it into position with a holding set screw, which I've seen another gentleman do online. I'm going to go that route, or you could just get a brand new head. So I'm going to try and do this the cheap way, but before we take these valves off, we will have to unbolt the head. So let's unbolt the head and see what we have behind door number 1. And all these head bolts should be 3/8 inch bolts. Yep. See, there's your problem. So let's take a quick look at this head gasket. Obviously in very poor condition. It's very brittle. You can see where some organic material has fallen in between the head and the block and has caused some corrosion. That's the corrosion right there. Aside from that, it looks like there's a leakage point between the cylinder and the crankcase right here. You could see that a little bit on camera. I have a feeling that's where our main failure point was, but this gasket is like starting to separate into two. Aside from that, the rest of the gasket appears to be in decent condition. Yeah, you can see all that, especially on the crankcase side. Also, you notice we have a lot of carbon buildup on the piston itself, so we'll try and clean that up the best we can. You can also rotate your engine manually if you'd like. Take a look inside the bore, look for scoring. Actually looks pretty good, just a lot of carbon buildup on the top of the piston here, which again, we'll clean that up the best that we can. Let's take a look at the head. So as for the head, you can see where that corrosion was occurring, right? It was taking place right here on the block. Some of the gasket is definitely sticking to the crankcase side. You can see the gasket was literally separating into two and deteriorating. A lot of carbon buildup here. So first I'm going to work on cleaning up the block, and then we will start tackling this head on the workbench. I'm going to start with a gasket scraper, and then I'm going to move on to some carb cleaner, carbon choke cleaner, and then I have a roll-lock disc with a Scotch-Brite pad, and I'm gently going to clean all this crud off of here. So I'll do that off camera, check back in when I'm finished. Alright, I have the block and that piston cleaned up. I took it down as far as I felt comfortable. I'm going to tell you the key to this job: knock off all the big stuff and heavy stuff with the scraper, and then roll-lock disc get yourself a lightly abrasive Scotch-Brite pad on that roll-lock disc die grinder and just work it down little by little. It's just going to make this job a whole lot easier. So let's move over to the head and start taking those valves out and take a look at that guide that I believe has shifted. Alright, I have the head on the workbench, and again, when I push this valve down, you can see it goes down all the way. That spring compresses all the way. This valve does not. It hits before the spring has a chance to fully compress. So again, I believe that guide has shifted. Now, I do not have a valve spring removal tool. I should get one though, but we're going to try taking these off by hand. So there are keepers on the top of these springs. Now, to prevent that valve from pushing down in this little cavity right here, I'm going to take a socket, put that socket against the valve, have a little magnet. I'm going to try and push down at the same time, get these keepers out. There's one. It's going to be fun putting these back in, I can tell you that much. There's two. Yep, she shifted all right. All right, let's try and remove this second valve here. There's one. There's two. Alright, so you're currently looking at the head. This is where the valve cover would mate to the head, the surface right here. Now these are the valve guides. Now this valve guide is completely fine, no issue. However, this valve guide has popped up, this sleeve right here. So once you discover you have this issue, you have two options. You could either try the fix that I'm going to attempt here in a moment, or you could purchase a new head assembly. That includes the new head, new rockers, push rod springs, so on and so forth. And that goes for like $180. I'm not about to spend $180 on this part. I think we can fix it for a few bucks. So I watched this channel. It's called Random Wrenching. And his fix is basically to tap this sleeve back down. By the way, he specified that the clearance from the top of this sleeve to this flange right here should be 0.19 thousandths of an inch. And he checked that on a brand new head. So from here to here, 0.19 thousandths of an inch, and you can use the bottom of a caliper to check that. So that's 0.19 thousandths of an inch. So we're going to tap that back down, and once we get it to within spec, we're going to drill through the casting right here. So we're going to drill through the aluminum, and we're going to drill through this part of the sleeve, and then we're going to just get into the actual valve sleeve itself. Just a little dimple. And from there, we're going to tap that hole. In my case, I'm going to do what he did. We're going to use 1024 set screws. I have a 1024 drill and tap. So again, go through the housing, through this outer sleeve, and just go into this inner sleeve a little bit. Set that set screw in there with some Loctite, and that should permanently correct this problem. So first thing we need to do is to tap this down in here, and I need to find something soft to tap on that with. Alright, I have a piece of brass. Let's try and tap this down here. If we go too far, we could always flip it around and tap it back out the other way. Should be pretty close. Got a little bit more to go. Check her again. 0.190. Alright, I have my head gently clamped down. I have a number 25 drill bit, which number 25 is the appropriate size for a 1024 tap. Drill is going to be speed 1. So let's try drilling in here, and we're going to take our time. again. We might stop there. So now that I've drilled through the head and I've started that drill bit a little bit into this sleeve, I'm going to punch this sleeve out and then we're going to tap the hole all the way through. I really need to invest in a set of brass punches. I'm just working with what I have here. So I have this little piece of brass. Try and tap this through. It actually worked out very well. Let's see if we can see the hole. Oh yeah. See that hole? And that is perfect. Didn't go all the way through. Just a little dimple. Looking good. Alright, now that we have that sleeve out of there, I'm going to take my 1024 tap. I'm going to tap this hole all the way through. Alright, now that we have that hole tapped, it's time to reinstall the valve guide. It definitely seems like it's going to be easier to install this from the bottom up, but it's going to be a lot harder to line up that hole. Looks pretty darn good. Alright, I have the valve guide lined up with the hole as close as I could get it. Smothered the set screw in blue Loctite. If I had red, I'd be using red. Question is, how much torque do you put on it? I don't want to over torque it and strip it. I'm going to leave it about there. You know, that set screw sticks out a little bit further than I like, but it's all they had in stock, and I think it's going to be alright. You know, for $1.25 in set screws, I think we're going to get away with one here. Anyway, let's slide the valve down in the valve guide to make sure we don't have any clearance issues. No issues. Everything's good. Alright, let's move on with cleaning up this head. Here's the before. And there's a look at the cleaned up head. Now, I'm sure my method isn't the best method. I ended up using a wire brush. I used the end of the wire brush right here to just get in here and scratch out as much carbon as I could. I was very careful not to wire brush where the valves seat on the head because you don't want to disturb that surface as long as it's in good condition. So aside from that, just took the die grinder with that Scotch-Brite pad and cleaned up the mating surface, and it looks pretty darn clean. You can see there's some corrosion right here, right? So the head normally sits like this, and this is where grass clippings and other organic material has sat for a while in between the head and the block, and it's just rotted away some of the aluminum there. So in the meantime, we can actually start assembling the valves back on the head. I did order an aftermarket head gasket, but came creased. You definitely don't want to use one of these if they're creased or bent in the shipping process. So I ordered 2 more of these. They should be here today, so hopefully we'll have this motor going by the end of today, if not tomorrow. And I also cleaned up the valves the best I could. Didn't really get too aggressive with it, just knocked off some of the loose carbon. Also got in here with a mild abrasive Scotch-Brite pad and just kind of spun it around a little bit, cleaned it up a little bit. Again, you want to be very careful not to disturb this surface on the valve where it seats into the head. So let's go ahead and reinstall this valve. And I have a feeling this is going to be very difficult, if not impossible, for one person to do by themselves without a valve spring compressor tool. So we'll see how this goes. I may have to ask somebody inside for a hand here. So I have the 2 retention caps sitting in that top washer right there. I wonder what happens if I just push this down and kind of try and guide them in. That was actually a lot easier than I thought. It's actually a lot easier to put them in than it is to take them out. Huh. Do the other side. There we are. Now if you remember earlier, the upper valve, which I believe is the exhaust valve, we weren't able to fully compress this valve in. So first I'm going to do the intake, the lower one. See how that goes all the way in, as it should. Now let's try the exhaust, the top one. And now it's going all the way in, as it should. So we'll just have to see how long this repair lasts, but I have a feeling things are going to be just fine with that set screw installation right there. So I think aside from that, we're waiting on the head gasket. So while we're waiting for that gasket, I've just been doing some other maintenance on the mower, hit all the grease points. I also degreased this engine cover / air filter housing, and I also bought some replacement air filters, so we're just going to go ahead and throw these in there. These are really easy to check, simple to install. I got a 2-pack I think for $10. I'll leave a link in the description down below. Alright, my new head gasket kit came in. No bends or cracks in the head gasket, so we're finally ready to proceed. Head block is also all clean and ready to be assembled. So if you buy one of these aftermarket kits like I did, oftentimes it will include 2 slightly different head gaskets. And what you need to do is just take a look at the imprint of the previous gasket on the motor, the main block. And if you take a look, see how these closely resemble one another, as where if I were to take this other gasket right here, on the top right here, it just doesn't match the imprint of the old gasket. So we're not going to use this one, we're going to use the one I had on the engine a moment ago. So what we need to talk about next is torque specs. Let me adjust the camera here. So when we're reinstalling the head block, we're going to torque these fasteners down in 3 stages. Stage 1, 72 inch-pounds, Stage 2, 144 inch-pounds, and Stage 3, 216 inch-pounds. The order in which we need to torque these bolts down is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. Another thing I want to note here, if you look at the main head, there's an alignment tab here and here. So that will hold the gasket in place while we're seating the head onto the main block, but you also just want to be sure that that gets pinned into the head. Okay. Now I'm going to start all these head bolts by hand. So I'm going to use my Makita driver to thread these bolts onto the block, but I'm not going to get these tight. Next I'm going to torque everything down to 72 inch-pounds in the order I went over a moment ago. Next we're going to torque down the bolts to 144 inch-pounds. And finally torque everything down to 216 inch-pounds. Next we can reinstall the exhaust. Now if you purchased an aftermarket gasket kit like I did, it should have included a new gasket for the exhaust manifold. Now the one for the exhaust I'm pretty sure should be the shinier one. It should match the sheen of the head gasket. Notice how these have the same sheen, so that tells me that this is made of a high temperature gasket material. So here's that other gasket that's not as shiny as the one we used on the exhaust side. It does not look like it matches the bolt holes on the intake side of the engine. On my engine in particular, this intake tube has this little slot right here. And when you remove this, you should have noticed that there should have been some type of O-ring on there. So I'm going to clean this up and just reinstall the O-ring. With that O-ring reinstalled, we can go ahead and reattach the intake to the block. I'm not sure what the torque spec is for the intake and the exhaust bolts. For the intake, I'm going with 144 inch-pounds. Now it's time to reinstall the push rods and the rocker. So first thing I'm going to do is take a rod, insert it into the spark plug hole, and rotate the engine, and just ensure again that we're at top dead center. So you're going to rotate this till the rod comes up out of the hole all the way. It's out of the way right there. Next, what I'm going to do is install the lower one first. Now the lower one should be the intake, so I'm going to insert this through this sleeve right here. I'm going to feel around, sure that it's properly seated. Can feel that it's properly seated now. Now, there should be a little metal cap. This little metal cap goes on the end of the valve, right? And we can take our rocker, put it over this threaded rod, ensure that this rocker is seated on the push rod, and we can take our holding nut, start to thread this down. Now what you're going to need is a feeler gauge. For the lower valve, the intake valve, there should be 1/4 thou of clearance in between this rocker and that cap that we installed a moment ago. So it's a little too tight right now. You can put that in between the rocker and that cap. Might be a little tight right there. That's 1/4 thou right there. So I'm going to hold that in place, and I'm going to take my adjustable wrench. I believe we said it was a T20 in the center of this, right? So there's that set screw in there. So using the adjustable wrench, going to hold that nut in place and tighten down that T20 in the middle of the nut. Get that good and tight. Take this off. We'll double check again. Feels like it may have loosened up a little bit. I'm going to go up to 5 and 6 thou, see if I could get it in there. Yeah, I could get the 5 in there. Could just barely get the 6 in there, so I need to adjust this a little bit, but you understand the principle. 1/4 thou for the lower intake valve clearance. Alright, so I have my lower valve clearance, intake valve clearance set at 1/4 thou, and that's in between the rocker and that cap, and I have my T20 set screw torqued down, so this isn't going anywhere. I will tell you real quick though, I hate the amount of play in this rocker. So the lower push rod is aluminum, and it slides within this plastic sleeve. I actually had a lower aluminum rod literally shear in half before from where I had to replace this plate, a new aluminum rod. I feel like that's intentional, right? They want this engine to fail, so it forces you to either buy a new one or take it to a service center. If that rod ever shears in half again, I'm just going to replace it with a steel rod. The upper rod is steel. So that's just a little tip I have for you there. So yeah, it is what it is. Just something to keep an eye on. The length of the steel rod and aluminum rod are the same, by the way. So we can start working on the upper valve, which should be the exhaust. So we're going to insert that steel rod within that plastic guide. Here's that little metal cap. We're going to put that on the end of the exhaust valve. Make sure it stays. Reinstall the rocker. And the clearance for the exhaust valve should be 6 thou. So I'll take this feeler gauge, put it in between the rocker and that cap. Get it tight. Hold it in place with an adjustable wrench. Tighten up the set screw, T20. Remove the adjustable wrench, check our clearance. This should be nice and tight. Just enough to get that 6 thou in there. Very tight. I'm going to call that good. Now we can reinstall the valve cover. Next, let's reinstall the spark plug. Make sure you remove anything you have covering up the intake for the carburetor. Alright, so one of the final things you want to do is just check the engine oil real quick before you start it. Make sure you have enough oil in there. It's at the low end of the dipstick, it should be fine. But I'm going to start the engine now. I'm going to let it run for 2 to 3 minutes without the air filter on, which is normally fine for the motor as long as the air is relatively clean. After it runs for 2 to 3 minutes, I'm going to take it back inside, do an oil change off camera. That's pretty self-explanatory, but I'd say it's really important to do an oil change after doing a job like this because you may have left some contaminants, some particles in there, and the oil filter should catch most of those, so just a good idea to change the oil is what I'm getting at. So without further ado, let's take this puppy outside and try and start it up. That's not good. They have a dead battery. Now I am expecting some smoke because a lot of oil did pour onto that exhaust. But I don't know, I still might have a bad camshaft compression release. Alright, so in closing, why was I having issues starting this motor? Well, 2 issues. One, I had a weak battery, and I think that's because I left the key on, so I threw the battery tender on the battery, got it all charged up, tried to start it again. I was still having somewhat of the same issue, and here's what I think the second issue is, and I'm going to make a video about this here shortly in the future. Now, the camshaft on this motor has a camshaft or a pressure release mechanism, and it's very common for the pressure release mechanism on the camshaft to fail. And basically what that means, if that pressure release mechanism isn't functioning properly, that starter has to overcome a tremendous amount of pressure, compression in the engine in order to turn it over. So I think due to the fact that we have a bad camshaft pressure release lever, that's really what's causing the issue at this point. I will make a repair video on this in the future, just order the parts, but I just wanted to close out the video by saying that. So I think also because I had a bad head gasket for quite some time, I think there was just such little compression in the motor that I was still able to start it without having this issue. But now that we have that repaired head gasket, you know, the engine's at full compression once again, so not having that camshaft compression release lever functioning properly is really why we're having difficulty starting the motor. So gonna conclude this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll let you know when I make the next video on the camshaft repair.